What if the most sacred temples of ancient India hid rituals so feared that even the priests who performed them refused to speak their names aloud afterward? The Hindu temples we admire today for their beauty, architecture, and spiritual symbolism were once the stage for ceremonies that blended devotion with dread, illumination with terror. Deep inside their stone corridors, beyond the public shrines and far from the pilgrims, existed a hidden world where the spiritual elite enacted rites, designed to manipulate cosmic forces, discipline human behavior, and maintain an unquestionable hierarchy of divine authority. These were not ceremonies meant for the eyes of common worshippers. These were nocturnal convocations reserved for those willing to confront shadows older than the temples themselves. Imagine stepping into a sanctuary where the air grows colder the deeper you walk, where the flicker of oil lamps reveals frescoes depicting gods in their most fearsome forms, and where every echo feels like a warning from something ancient watching behind the walls. The priests who entered these inner chambers understood that power, real power, was never gentle. It demanded sacrifice, secrecy, and the ability to blur the line between faith and fear. And in these hidden rituals, they cultivated a level of psychological influence that allowed them to govern entire regions without ever lifting a weapon. For the people living around these temples, rumors spread like smoke. Whispers of chants performed at impossible hours, of strange lights rising from sanctuaries with no windows, of chosen individuals who entered the temple one night and emerged changed, silent, or never seen again. These dark ceremonies became a spectral presence embedded in cultural memory, shaping both reverence and terror. Even centuries later, fragmented oral traditions still recall the nights when the gods were said to awaken not with blessings, but with demands. What makes these accounts so unsettling is not their supernatural dimension, but their deliberate structure. The rituals were engineered, meticulously designed, to keep communities obedient, to establish a divine hierarchy impossible to question, and to remind everyone that spiritual authority held a power far greater than earthly kings. The deeper you dig into these forgotten practices, the clearer it becomes that the ancient priesthood mastered a form of psychological domination disguised as sacred duty. And the question that lingers is whether these ceremonies were meant to honor the gods or to control the people who feared them. If you've ever wondered why some ancient rituals refuse to disappear from collective memory, why they leave a stain even after centuries of silence, stay with this story. What you're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about sacred spaces and the forces that shape them. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know how much of this hidden side of history you were aware of, and make sure to like the video and check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Your engagement helps bring these forgotten shadows back into the light, and what comes next will take us even deeper into the heart of these darkened sanctuaries. The deeper you move into the forgotten corridors of these ancient Hindu temples, the more you realize that fear was not an accidental byproduct of devotion. It was a calculated tool. Among the rituals most whispered about across generations, the so-called offering of shadows stands out as one of the most psychologically sophisticated ceremonies ever engineered by an ancient priesthood. This ritual did not rely on physical punishment or direct coercion. Instead, it manipulated perception, illusion, and the primal dread of the unknown. Villagers believed that the gods themselves stretched their shadows across the earth to claim obedience, but the truth was far more human and far more deliberate. Imagine a temple whose architecture was designed not merely for worship, but for theater. Hallways angled to distort sound, carvings that twisted into grotesque shapes when touched by lamplight, chambers where flames cast silhouettes so unnaturally large and distorted that anyone watching felt the presence of something impossible. Priests understood how the mind reacted to darkness, how fear magnifies every movement, every whisper, every flicker. During the offering of shadows, they used controlled fire, hidden vents, reflective surfaces, and rhythmic chanting to create an atmosphere where reality seemed to bend under divine pressure. People who witnessed it were convinced they had seen the gods moving through the walls. The ceremony typically began at midnight. The villagers would gather outside the temple, hearing the interior rumble with layered chants that crossed registers, low, resonant tones that vibrated through the stone mixed with sharp whispers meant to mimic breath. Behind the ear, Inside, the priests enacted a performance of light manipulation that made their shadows stretch impossibly long, shifting and merging with carved deities until no one could distinguish human from divine. And this was the point: to erase doubt, to create the illusion that the clergy moved with supernatural authority. Over time, these rituals produced entire communities governed by awe, fear, and silent compliance. When a priest declared that a certain action had angered the gods, the villagers believed it without question because they had seen those impossible shadows and heard the unearthly echoes. The offering of shadows was an instrument of social engineering, binding the people to the temple with invisible chains woven from terror and reverence. The villagers lived with the constant awareness that they were being watched not just by priests, but by powers they could neither understand nor resist. And what makes this even more striking is how little the ritual required in terms of physical enforcement. No soldiers, no visible threats, no explicit punishments. The fear of divine retribution, manufactured through carefully orchestrated sensory manipulation, was enough to keep entire populations aligned with temple authority. Year after year, the ritual strengthened the aura of the sacred, transforming the temple into a psychological fortress. Even long after the practice disappeared, the stories remained, passed down as warnings not to anger the unseen, forces dwelling in the sanctuaries. The remnants of these accounts reveal a world shaped not just by belief, but by carefully engineered perception. Once people witnessed shadows that behaved like living entities, they never questioned the priests again. And as we move forward, the darker layers of these ceremonies begin to expose themselves, revealing rituals where silence, blood, and terror were not just symbolic gestures, but the very language of the sacred. The deeper you venture into the hidden history of these temples, the more you begin to understand that some rituals were never meant to be spoken aloud, even by those who performed them. Among the most feared was the silent blood ceremony, a rite so shrouded in secrecy that its very name was passed down only through fragmented whispers. Unlike other temple practices that blended devotion with spectacle, this ritual relied on absolute stillness. No chanting, no drums, no movement other than what necessity demanded. Its power came from the unsettling quiet, a silence so absolute that participants claimed they could hear their own heartbeat echo against the stone. This was the moment when the priests confronted what they believed were wandering forces, spirits, demons, or cosmic energies that required appeasement through offerings that left no room for error. Imagine a chamber lit only by a single flame, its glow barely strong enough to reveal the carvings of wrathful deities towering over the priests. In the center sat a stone platform where the chosen offering was placed, accompanied by meticulously arranged implements. Everything about the ritual was precise, intentional, and rigid. One misplaced gesture, according to temple lore, could unleash consequences not only for the priests but for the entire community. This fear made the silent blood ceremony a psychological weapon as much as a religious act. Those who lived near the temple grew up hearing stories that the gods demanded renewal through sacrifice, that the world's balance depended on the priest's ability to calm the unseen forces stirring beyond human perception. The offering itself was not always literal blood, though the name encouraged that interpretation. Sometimes it consisted of symbolic items representing impurities or transgressions, carefully selected to embody whatever misfortune the community feared. Other times, temple texts imply that more serious sacrifices were made, sacrifices whose stories vanished as quickly as they appeared. What mattered most was the silence, an agreement among the priests and the witnesses that no sound should escape the chamber lest it call attention from forces that were not meant to be provoked. The silence was so absolute that participants described it as oppressive, a suffocating pressure that made even the smallest breath feel dangerous. But the psychological impact extended beyond the ritual chamber. Villagers believed that if the offering was insufficient, signs would appear immediately: sickened livestock, strange shadows at dusk, or sudden tempests that ravaged crops. Every misfortune, no matter how ordinary, could be traced back to the idea that the ceremony had failed to satisfy whatever entity presided over their fate. The priests, aware of this fear, wielded it with quiet authority. They alone claimed the knowledge to interpret omens, declare purity or impurity, and dictate whether additional sacrifices were required. This power kept the people in a constant state of vigilance, always mindful of their behavior, always afraid of being the cause of a ritual repetition. And what makes the silent blood ceremony particularly haunting is how little of it survives in tangible records. It was never carved into temple walls like other rites, never celebrated in festivals, never taught openly. It existed in shadows, spoken of only by those who believed the balance of the universe hinged on their obedience. The fragments that remain suggest that these rituals allowed priests to maintain a tight grip over entire populations, ensuring that fear, not faith alone, guided daily life. As you peel back these layers of secrecy, the line separating religious duty from calculated manipulation becomes impossible to ignore, revealing a world shaped by rituals engineered to bind people to their spiritual rulers through silence, sacrifice, and the ever-present dread of divine punishment. The deeper you go into the hidden world of ancient Hindu temple rites, the more you encounter ceremonies that blur the line between spiritual purification and deliberate social punishment. Among the most feared was the ritual known as the Night of the Possessed, a spectacle draped in sacred authority but engineered to reinforce the absolute dominance of the priestly class. Unlike the silent blood ceremony, which unfolded in suffocating stillness, this ritual thrived on noise. Rhythmic drums, ritual bells, and forceful chants meant to overwhelm the senses and strip participants of any emotional control. What the villagers saw as divine cleansing was, in truth, a highly orchestrated event where the clergy decided who was spiritually safe, who was dangerously tainted, and who needed to be broken before the eyes of the entire community. The ritual began long before nightfall. Priests selected individuals, always discreetly, always with strategic intent, who were rumored to possess restless spirits. Sometimes these were people who challenged temple authority, sometimes those who had become inconvenient for local politics, and other times simply villagers whose misfortune made them easy targets. Once chosen, they were isolated in dimly lit rooms where incense burned so heavily it blurred the edges of reality. Hours later, when the temple courtyard filled with anxious villagers, the chosen were brought out, trembling, surrounded by priests whose chants grew louder with every step. The crowd believed they were witnessing the expulsion of a Kasi demonic presence. In reality, the ritual was a public display of control. What made the Night of the Possessed so psychologically powerful was the way it weaponized fear and spectacle. Priests would ask the crowd pointed questions about whether they had witnessed strange behavior, unusual dreams, or unexplained illness from the accused. Villagers, terrified of being associated with impurity, often exaggerated or invented signs, unknowingly feeding the narrative the priests had already set in motion. As the ritual intensified, the accused would be pushed to emotional collapse, crying, shaking, sometimes screaming, as the priests declared these reactions evidence of a spirit being forced out. Even those who knew they were innocent found themselves unable to withstand the pressure of hundreds of eyes, the deafening drums, and the accusation of divine judgment. For the temple hierarchy, this ritual served a precise purpose. It reinforced the belief that the priests alone could interpret spiritual danger. It reminded the community that no one, not even the seemingly strong, respected, or influential, was beyond divine scrutiny. And most importantly, it maintained an atmosphere where resistance felt both sacrilegious and suicidal. The villagers walked away from each ceremony convinced that the gods had spoken through the priests, that fear had been justified, and that obedience was the only path to spiritual safety. But beneath the chants and the theatrics, something more insidious lingered. These ceremonies created a system where silence protected the powerful. Anyone who criticized the temple risked being selected for the next Night of the Possessed. Any whisper of dissent could be twisted into evidence of spiritual disturbance. The result was a community bound together not by devotion but by anxiety, each person hoping the ritual torchlight never fell on them. As these events repeated over generations, they became woven into cultural memory, shaping behaviors and beliefs long after the original ceremonies vanished. And the echoes of those nights, the fear, the spectacle, the psychological mastery, still resonate in the fragments preserved by oral tradition. If this ritual strikes you as one of the most disturbing examples of spiritual manipulation, share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you interpret the power dynamics behind a ceremony designed to define purity, punish dissent, and control entire communities through fear. Among the darkest temple practices whispered through generations, none carried a heavier weight than the ritual known as the Judgment of the Goddesses. The ceremony targeted young women chosen not for their virtue, devotion, or spiritual calling, but for their symbolic usefulness to the temple hierarchy. The priesthood claimed these girls were selected by divine intuition, destined to channel the energies of fierce feminine deities whose wrath and favor shaped the cosmic order. But beneath the religious narrative lay a far more calculated purpose. These ceremonies reinforced the belief that women existed as vessels for forces beyond their control, stripping them of identity and autonomy in the name of spiritual duty. The ritual began with an unsettling silence. Families were summoned under the guise of honor, told that their daughter had been recognized by the temple's inner circle. Yet the moment she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. Her clothing was replaced with ritual garments, adorned with symbols of deities known for both compassion and destruction. Incense thickened the air, blurring her vision and weakening her sense of direction. From that moment forward, she was no longer addressed by name. She had become an offering, an embodiment of divine expectation. Priests conducted a series of tests meant to awaken the goddess within her. These trials were not spiritual reflections, but structured psychological pressures designed to erode resistance. The girl was forced to stand before towering statues illuminated by flickering lamps that distorted their features into monstrous expressions. She was questioned, pushed, and scrutinized until her words faltered, her breath trembled, and her sense of reality blurred under the weight of ritual authority. Any hesitation, any moment of fear, was interpreted as evidence of impurity, fuel for the priesthood's narrative that she needed deeper, harsher purification. As the ceremony progressed, the symbolism heightened. The girl was surrounded by elder priestesses who mirrored her movements, creating the impression that she was caught between worlds, neither fully human nor fully divine. Drums pounded in slow, deliberate rhythms intended to alter her heartbeat. The ritual fire crackled and spit sparks that danced across the chamber like fragments of unseen spirits. When she finally reached the center platform, the priests declared whether the goddess had accepted or rejected her. This proclamation was never truly divine. It served the political needs of the moment. If she was accepted, her life no longer belonged to her family. She became property of the temple, bound to serve in rituals that demanded emotional endurance, physical resilience, and absolute obedience. If she was rejected, the consequences were equally devastating. The village viewed rejection as a sign of hidden sin or ancestral impurity, branding the girl and her family with stigma that could last generations. Some households were ostracized, others were forced into additional offerings to repair the spiritual imbalance. No matter the outcome, the temple emerged with greater authority, its influence deepened by the fear of divine judgment. The power of the judgment of the goddesses lay not in physical violence, but in the psychological devastation it inflicted. It framed womanhood as something dangerous, unstable, and dependent on the temple's control. It turned girls into symbolic battlegrounds for cosmic forces, and it cemented the belief that the priesthood alone could interpret the unpredictable will of the goddesses. The echoes of these ceremonies survived long after the rituals ended, imprinting themselves onto cultural memory as warnings of what could happen when spiritual authority became intertwined with manipulation and fear. Among the hidden corridors of ancient Hindu temple culture, few rituals carried as much terror as the ordeal known as the Path of Flames. Unlike other ceremonies that relied on symbolism or whispered lore, this rite was brutally physical, a test designed to break the will of anyone the priesthood deemed spiritually impure or socially inconvenient. It was never officially recorded in temple inscriptions, never celebrated in oral hymns, and never acknowledged publicly by the religious elite. Yet its memory lingers in fragments of folklore, in stories too consistent across regions to be dismissed as mere superstition. Somewhere, deep in the sanctuaries, fire was used not as a symbol of purification, but as a weapon of psychological domination. The ritual began with a summons. Individuals were accused of impurity, a term so vague it could apply to almost anyone. A failed harvest, a family dispute, or even a dream interpreted unfavorably by a priest could mark someone as spiritually contaminated. Once chosen, the accused was led into an antechamber where torches flickered along the walls, casting jagged shadows that made the carved deities appear alive. Priests circled the accused, chanting in rhythms that felt more like threats than prayers. Each chant emphasized themes of cleansing, sacrifice, and divine justice, words carefully chosen to erode resistance before the ritual even began. The path of flames itself was a long corridor lined with fire pits, shallow enough not to engulf a person but deep enough to inflict serious burns if one stumbled. The corridor was intentionally uneven, designed to disorient the senses. Smoke hung low in the air, forcing the accused to take shallow, frantic breaths. Every step became a negotiation between pain and survival. Priests followed close behind, their chants rising in intensity, urging the flames to reveal truth and burn impurity. To the villagers who heard whispers of this ritual, it seemed like the gods themselves demanded the ordeal. But in reality, the priests controlled every aspect of the environment: the height of the flames, the thickness of the smoke, the rhythm of the chanting, ensuring that no one walked through without being psychologically broken. Women were especially vulnerable to this ritual. Their steps were scrutinized, their reactions interpreted through layers of superstition. If a woman hesitated, it was taken as proof of impurity. If she moved too quickly, it meant panic had exposed her hidden flaws. The ritual was designed so that every outcome validated the priesthood's narrative. Families who hoped the ordeal would clear their loved one's name often found themselves deeper in the temple's grip, pressured to offer gifts, labor, or further sacrifices to restore balance. The path of flames became less a purification rite and more a mechanism for controlling behavior, enforcing obedience, and reminding the community that no one, no matter how innocent, was beyond the reach of divine judgment. What made the ritual truly terrifying, however, was its aftermath. The accused rarely emerged unchanged. Some fainted from smoke inhalation, others collapsed from pain and exhaustion, and many carried burns that became permanent reminders of their ordeal. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological ones. Survivors often withdrew from their communities, convinced that the gods had marked them. Villagers, equally frightened of divine contamination, kept their distance, allowing the stigma to fester. The priests, meanwhile, reinforced the idea that the ritual had cleansed the individual, framing their suffering as a sacred necessity rather than a calculated act of control. Over generations, the path of flames created a culture where fear governed behavior more effectively than any written law. People whispered about the corridor of fire but avoided questioning its purpose. And the priesthood, shielded by spiritual authority, continued to wield flames as instruments of dominance, ensuring that purity was whatever they dictated and impurity whatever they chose to condemn. Among all the hidden mechanisms of control within ancient Hindu temple culture, few were as psychologically devastating as the Circle of Truth. This ritual was framed as a sacred interrogation, a ceremony where the gods themselves were believed to expose lies, hidden sins, and unspoken intentions. But behind the divine narrative, the circle functioned as a formidable political tool, a carefully designed system that allowed the priesthood to interrogate, intimidate, and silence anyone who threatened their authority. Unlike other rites that targeted individuals through physical ordeal or symbolic sacrifice, this ceremony weaponized confession itself, turning a person's own fears into instruments of submission. The ritual took place in a chamber deliberately constructed to heighten vulnerability. The floor was circular, marked with intricate geometric patterns symbolizing cosmic order. The accused was placed at the center, where an overhead opening allowed a thin shaft of light to fall directly upon them, creating the illusion that the gods were watching from above. Surrounding the circle stood the priests, their garments darkened to blend into the shadows, making their presence feel more like an unseen force than a group of human interrogators. Every movement, every breath, every tremor of the accused was amplified by the acoustics of the chamber, turning silence into a pressure that few could withstand. The interrogation followed a precise rhythm. Priests posed questions in tones that shifted between soft echoes and thunderous assertions. The accused was required to answer slowly, with absolute clarity. If their voice faltered, the priests interpreted it as a sign of hidden guilt. If their words flowed too confidently, they accused them of rehearsing lies. The ritual was designed so that truth, or falsehood, became irrelevant. The only possible outcome was the reinforcement of the temple's authority. Over time, the community began to associate even minor disputes with the possibility of being summoned into the circle. A family argument, a disagreement over land, a whispered criticism of a priest, all could end under the harsh glare of the ritual spotlight. Women suffered under this ritual in uniquely insidious ways. Their emotions were treated as evidence. Tears were interpreted as guilt. Silence meant defiance. anger became proof of impurity. Priests often framed their questions to corner them psychologically, forcing them into confessions shaped more by fear than reality. Once a woman was declared revealed by the gods, her reputation unraveled instantly. Families withdrew from her, villages avoided her. The temple maintained that she had been purified, but the community treated her as tainted. In many cases, this ritual's power extended far beyond the chamber, unraveling marriages, breaking alliances, and solidifying the priesthood's grasp over social dynamics. The circle also became a way for the temple to shape collective memory. When accusations emerged against a prominent family, a ritual revelation could permanently stain their name. When political alliances shifted, a strategic interrogation could fracture communities. The ceremony's supposed spiritual authority made it immune to scrutiny. No one questioned the gods. No one questioned the priests who spoke for them. Decades of such interrogations created a culture where people monitored their own words, censored their thoughts, and suppressed their doubts. Fear became second nature, woven into the rhythm of daily life. What makes the Circle of Truth particularly haunting is how deeply it embedded itself into local identity. Even after the temple lost influence, stories of the circle persisted. Warnings passed to children, rumors shared during festivals, memories that refused to fade. The ritual's echoes lived on in inherited caution, in the way communities dealt with conflict, in the belief that truth was something dangerous, something that could be turned against you if spoken at the wrong time. If the psychological brutality of this ritual struck you the way it struck generations before us, share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you interpret a ceremony designed not to reveal truth, but to control it. As we move deeper into the psychological architecture of ancient temple rituals, one ceremony emerges as a haunting example of how spiritual symbolism could be transformed into a tool of absolute manipulation. Known in scattered oral traditions as the smile of the deity, this ritual revolved around masks, elaborate, fearsome, and intricately crafted to depict divine beings in their most unsettling forms. These were not the gentle icons found in public shrines. These masks portrayed gods with contorted expressions, elongated fangs, widened eyes, and exaggerated smiles that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the painted wooden surface. The ceremony used these masks to blur the boundary between human performer and supernatural presence, immersing participants in a haze of fear and fascination that shattered their sense of emotional stability. The ritual took place at twilight, the hour when shadows lengthen and the world seems to shift between clarity and uncertainty. Temple attendants arranged rows of oil lamps so that their flames cast distorted reflections across the chamber walls. As the first drum beats echoed through the sanctuary, priests wearing the deity masks entered with slow, deliberate steps. Their movements were not meant to imitate human behavior, but to evoke something otherworldly, jerking motions, sharp turns, and rhythmic pacing that kept observers disoriented. Each mask was carved to appear as if the deity was smiling directly at the viewer, creating a sensation that the gods themselves were watching, judging, and silently demanding obedience. The psychological impact of this environment was immense. People conditioned to revere divine images suddenly found themselves confronting deities rendered in forms meant to unsettle the deepest layers of the mind. The exaggerated smiles represented cosmic power, divine judgment, and an unspoken threat. Temple texts imply that these masks were not merely artistic expressions, but carefully engineered tools. Their proportions were designed to activate instinctive fear responses, their colors chosen to stimulate emotional imbalance, and their movements choreographed to create hypnotic patterns in the torchlight. The more one stared, the more the mask seemed alive, as if its expression shifted from benevolent to sinister in the blink of an eye. At the height of the ritual, the chanting intensified. Participants, already overwhelmed by sensory overload, began to experience dissociation, a feeling of separation from their surroundings. This was intentional. The ceremony aimed to break down emotional defenses, leaving individuals receptive to the priest's declarations about the will of the gods. People believed the deities were speaking through the masked figures, issuing warnings, commands, and judgments. The words of the priests took on an uncanny weight, as though they were no longer human voices, but supernatural decrees. The psychological effect was absolute. Villagers internalized these proclamations as divine law, bending their lives around instructions they believed came from beings more powerful than themselves. Women, in particular, were profoundly affected by this ritual. Their roles in the ceremony varied, from observers to participants chosen to stand before the masked priests. The mask's exaggerated features were said to reveal impurities within the soul, and women subjected to this scrutiny often left convinced they had been exposed before the unseen world. These emotional wounds lingered, shaping self-perception, social identity, and religious behavior long after the ritual ended. Families adjusted their actions according to the supposed revelations of the masks, further extending the ritual's influence beyond the temple walls. What makes the smile of the deity especially disturbing is the precision with which psychological pressure was applied. This was not chaotic superstition. It was a system, crafted, refined, and deployed to maintain authority. The masks became symbols not of divine benevolence, but of the unseen power the temple wielded over the minds of its people. Even after the rituals faded into history, the memory of those unnatural smiles lived on in regional myths, capturing a fear that could not be fully understood yet refused to disappear. Among the shadowed remnants of ancient temple rites, one ceremony stands apart as a final, irreversible sentence: the ritual of the last breath. Unlike other practices meant to intimidate, purify, or manipulate, this ritual aimed for something far more devastating: the complete erasure of a person's identity. It was performed only on those the priesthood condemned as enemies of the spiritual order. A phrase broad enough to include dissidents, critics, rivals, and anyone whose existence disrupted the temple's carefully maintained hierarchy. This was not a ritual of death. It was a ritual of disappearance. To undergo the last breath meant being severed from the community, stripped of memory, and symbolically expelled from the world of the living without the release of dying. The preparation for the ritual was orchestrated with unnerving precision. The chosen individual was confined in isolation for days, denied conversation, sunlight, or any sensory input beyond the murmur of distant chants. This sensory deprivation weakened their grasp on reality, making them more susceptible to the psychological unraveling that awaited them. When the day of the ritual arrived, the accused was led into a subterranean chamber where the air hung heavy with smoke from ritual resins. The walls were carved with scenes of dissolution, bodies turning to ash, faces fading into swirling patterns, names lost among symbols. Everything in the environment reinforced the message: identity is fragile, and the gods have the power to erase it completely. The ceremony began with a declaration that the accused no longer belonged to the human world. Priests walked in a slow circle around them, chanting verses that stripped away titles, relationships, and history. The accused was forbidden to speak their own name. If they attempted to assert who they were, the priests interpreted it as defiance against divine judgment. Masks representing destructive deities were held close to the face of the accused, their warped expressions meant to distort emotional perception and induce panic. The chamber's lighting was manipulated so that shadows moved unnaturally, creating the impression that invisible forces were closing in. Gradually, the accused began to lose the coherence of their thoughts, overwhelmed by the sensory assault and the relentless chant that proclaimed their unmaking. At the heart of the ritual was the symbolic extraction of breath. The accused was instructed to exhale slowly, while priests recited mantras claiming to capture the final trace of their identity. This breath, they said, represented everything the individual had been: memories, desires, emotions, the entire essence of a life. Once the breath was released into the chamber, the priests enacted a dramatized gesture of severing it from the body. The accused, already weakened and terrified, often believed the ritual had truly removed something vital. This belief was the ritual's true power. The individual walked away convinced they no longer possessed the right to exist within the community. Once the last breath was completed, the accused was not executed or exiled. Instead, they were returned to daily life as a hallowed presence. Families were forbidden from acknowledging them. Their name was never spoken again. Villagers avoided eye contact, refusing to interact with someone the gods had unwritten. The person became a living ghost, wandering among people who treated them as if they had died. Many withdrew into silence, unable to reclaim a sense of self after being systematically dismantled. Others left the village and vanished, fulfilling the ritual's purpose of disappearance. The priesthood used this ritual sparingly, not because it was sacred, but because its psychological impact intensified when it remained rare. Its mere possibility kept people obedient. It served as the ultimate reminder that the temple could erase not only a person's status or reputation, but their very identity. Its legacy, preserved in fragments of folklore and whispered warnings, reveals a chilling truth about how absolute power can reshape the human mind, not by force, but by convincing someone that they no longer exist in the eyes of their community.